A, African, A, American, C, community, E, economic, T, transformation, S, survey. You know, it was part of a group conversation, and I think it was Kathy and Hakeem who, began to put the pieces together, right? We were talking about, as Hakeem likes to say, Afro-New Mexico. We were talking about the transformation of African-American communities here. And so the African-American Economic and Community Transformation Survey, we had started off talking about how are we going to capture some of this data. And that was a survey conversation. And so I think in the end it was Kathy who put it all together and said, how about this? And the name felt like it really did capture everything we were trying to accomplish.
Welcome to the Writers in the Community class. I teach in UNM Chicano Studies, and I think that is actually something that deserves note. I have a master's in communications from UNM as well. I finished my master's in 2014, and this is the second program I've had an opportunity to teach in as an African American instructor with a community that let's say a racial community that I don't necessarily identify with, but certainly an ideological community that I identify with. And I think it speaks to the idea that we can all learn something from other people's liberation. And I think a lot of the story of being black in America, is that of fighting for our rights. And other communities have that too. So I learn from their story, and then I get to be in here and share my story, and hopefully these students learn from me. When I first heard the term statistically insignificant, I was a first-year employee at the Office of African American Affairs. I lived here all of maybe 2.5 years, and I was reading a New Mexico Department of Health report about cancer rates. And it had cancer rates for Anglos, it had cancer rates for Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, and it had cancer rates, these are mortality rates, death rates, right, for the Native American population. And then when it got to the African American population, there was no line, there was no dot, there was an asterisk, and it said statistically insignificant. And my first thought was that, how do you tell a black person who lost their spouse, their child, or their grandparent that your grandparent's death doesn't count? That suffering that you felt was fake, that it was an illusion, it was a myth, and it was in fact statistically insignificant. We didn't even measure it, we didn't even count it. And so if there's one child, right, that goes hungry in a community, and even if you're not tracking that, does that mean that family doesn't have a real outcome, a real grief, And so that's the kind of logic we kind of went to these funders with, is saying, we're here though. We're here, and I know that it might not be politically expedient or prudent necessarily to cater to our community. It's not going to necessarily result in an overwhelming electoral landslide of any sort. It may even be an unpopular thing to do, because you're going to have larger communities saying that, why are you paying so much attention to them because there's only 10 of them, right? But it's the right thing to do. That kind of argument may not work well in the corporate world because they're more concerned about bottom lines, but I would hope it would work well in the philanthropic world, because that world is about feeling. It's about individuals. It's about one human at a time, and not just the politics of scale and the politics of population. And because if you can impact the community in which the disparity is most acutely felt, then it will trickle up to other communities. That's the whole phrase, a rising tide raises all ships. I'm a track guy, and in track, you're only as fast as your weakest leg. So if we're running a 4x400 relay, and I'm trying to help us win the Olympics, I'm not gonna just focus on my fastest runner, I'm gonna focus on my weakest leg, because that's what's gonna help us win the Olympics. And I don't know, maybe we need more coaches in the state Senate. So, the pre-work, the backstory, when I first went to the foundation, and this is before I was a WKK Foundation fellow, I had a conversation with Kathy at the time I was in Roots Revival around how do we how do we fund that so that it continues? Like, that experience was meaningful to me. I really like what Kathy was doing in the community. I was already impressed with the work that she had done with the Black History Organizing Project and bringing all these community organizations together. And like me, she's an artist, and that's what she was using to do it.
I'm in New Mexico for more than 30 years, and I've worked in a lot of different arenas in the public sector, in the nonprofit sector, and in the private sector. And so I feel like I have a lot of cross-sector experience that I bring to AACETS. And I also have been a volunteer and a worker in the Black community for all those years that I've been here. That was my upbringing, is that you get in to your community and you start to work and you do what needs to be done. So Hakeem and I were both looking for ways to do programming for our youth. Positive youth development was something that we were both interested in, and we knew that if we came together that we could kind of figure out a model that worked.
It began with just a brainstorm, like, who can we talk to? And then it started to grow into a bigger conversation, like, well, we've talked to some foundations and nobody seems to be interested in this work. And that led to more questions, like, so what is the investment, the philanthropic investment particular to the Black community? And then it just became a bigger, like, investigation into, okay, so how do we raise this issue?
Well, we started looking at the Kellogg Foundation. They came into New Mexico and they said they were going to be here for a generation. They wanted to make some significant inroads into changing life in New Mexico. And we looked at it and said, we want to make sure that everyone's included in that. And we saw that they were doing some targeted interventions in the Native American community, targeted interventions in the Hispanic community, and that we did not have that same level of targeted intervention. So we went to the Kellogg Foundation and said, why don't we look at doing something that focuses on building and strengthening the Black community in New Mexico, because we feel like that's an important piece of this whole puzzle. If they were going to be successful in their mission, then everybody has to be included.
Kathy and I went to Kellogg. Kellogg said, hey, do you know this guy Everett Hill? I said, I do. I said, he's a good friend of mine too. And Everett does like consulting work with foundations, and he knows that world. And Kathy and I had questions of that world, so it was a no-brainer to put us all together.
My role on the team was really to help design and deploy the data collection process. So we utilized the community-based participatory research protocol and brought together groups of people from the community, took them through a process of asking them what they thought was important, what assets do they believe actually exist, and then through both a frequency analysis of that language data and kind of looking at threads that emerge from the data, we began to develop a picture of some of the things that folks felt were actual assets in the community, but things that were gaps, things that were missing that we could potentially build.
So we had some vacancies and we had to fill them. And we knew we needed a particular skill set to fill them, because we were moving forward in a way that we were going to organize through arts-based community development, but also through a large communications campaign and messaging campaign. And so we needed to bring in campaign and messaging professionals. And so we invited Tracy Dingman, who is a website administrator now for the county and has a long career in journalism. She was a writer for Tribune and Journal, and really has a political awareness of the community through some of her work at Center for Civic Policy.
So I'm a student of history, and I feel that it's really important to do your research and find out what has come before, what has worked, what can you build on. And I feel the AACETS team is also very cognizant of that. I feel like part of my role with the AACETS team is to provide that research and that history and that grounding. The civil rights era opened a great many doors for African Americans in New Mexico, but the end to troubles were far from over. Many equal rights were won, but mainstream New Mexico was not ready to hand African Americans a full portion on a silver platter. There are 42 seats in the New Mexico Senate and 70 seats in the New Mexico House of Representatives. More than 32 people make up the governor's cabinet, with literally hundreds of other public positions available as mayors, school board members, university regents, county government positions, and several others. However, only a handful of African Americans have ever filled them.
And then we brought in Gene Grant, and Gene has a very, what do you call it, decorated background in politics. He was a staffer for former U.S. Congressman Heather Wilson, and now he is the host of a political talk show on New Mexico PBS. So yeah, his show is like the big brother to my show. So I'm lucky. If it's not for Gene, breaking the color barrier, I don't know if that's true, but I think Gene broke the color barrier on New Mexico PBS. Then I don't get a show this many years later. So.
I think the unique skill set I bring is the media stuff that I could bring to the group. My big concern is, how do we get a coherent message out to brothers and sisters statewide that folks can respond to?
This entire project was really undertaken with the backdrop of the data that, as it currently exists around kind of the state of Afro-New Mexico. The median household income for African Americans in New Mexico is around $37,000, $38,000 a year, as opposed to our white counterparts, it's about $54,000, $55,000. We're about 2.5–3% of the population in New Mexico, which translates into about 43,000 African Americans. The greatest density by percentage of us is in Curry County, down south. But in Bernalillo County, where we're about 3% of the population, it's the most populous. Bernalillo County is the most populous county in New Mexico, and African American numbers reflect that. We have some infrastructure in New Mexico, like the African American Performing Arts Center and the Pavilion. We have an Office of African American Affairs. We have a New Mexico Black Chamber of Commerce. There are many African American churches in communities all over New Mexico, right, where these both edifices and community centers of community become places where we might begin to root new strategies to help transform our communities.
Around 10 years from now, the Black community looks like a seat at the table. It looks like when decisions are being made about our community, people who are in our community are part of the decision-making process.
I think some of the work that we're really doing with AACETS is really focused on strengthening our internal communication. We went around the state and we talked to a lot of people who didn't live in Albuquerque, who said that they just felt completely overlooked. There were all sorts of good things that might be happening, but they don't know anything about them. They don't know about scholarship opportunities. They don't know about all of the candidate, say, workshops, activist workshops, communication workshops that might be happening, in Albuquerque, maybe even in Santa Fe, because New Mexico is so geographically far-flung. We really, really hope to establish and strengthen a communication network among Black folks in all of the communities of New Mexico, where we know that have significant Black populations. We know where they are.
If you are an African American head of household, either single or two-family head of household, you can pick whatever part of the state you want. Where are you going to go? Well, you really need to have some information about our community, where we need to be, how to make decisions about where you think your family needs to go. I think that's what we're going to provide 10 years from now.
I think the Black family is now and has always been strong. It's going to continue to be strong and to survive, but we're going to have a different approach, and it's an approach of focusing on our assets as opposed to always talking about the deficits and talking about what's wrong. We'll be talking about what's right and how we can build up our strengths, and focusing on strengths, which is a very important paradigm shift.
Because ultimately, it's not about perfection, it's about progress, right? And what we want to see are folks in our community making progress. And I think for a long time, I don't know if we felt like we're making good progress. Like, in terms of policy, right? Being able to capture good data that's disaggregated by race at the state level. That would be some progress. The ability to begin to bring down the numbers of African American kids in the education system who are long-term suspended, right? Being able to see some tangible movement in those numbers. being able to see more African Americans who are, and we do well in this area now, who own their own businesses, right? But to begin to proliferate in terms of folks who are running their own businesses.
I would love to see the Black community have a better relationship with the media. So it isn't just when something goes wrong that the media is coming out and covering us and saying, oh, well, what is everybody all mad about? Why is everybody yelling? What is the latest controversy? Instead, build relationships with the media. I mean, it's on us, it's also on them as well. Build relationships with the media so that there's stories in the media all the time about just normal Black life. The consumers of the media are out there and they're making decisions based on what they see in the media. So that is one way for us to reach people, to normalize our presence and our goodness and our contributions to the community.
So I hope one of the legacies of this project is that we continue to focus more on the asset-oriented approach to doing some of this research and really understanding what we're doing well and being able to tell that story better with data so that folks have a better sense of kind of what we're accomplishing and then still what's left to do.
When the work that you're doing is hitting its targets and that you're able to evaluate it and say we have been successful, then even those people who are skeptics or quote unquote antagonists have to respect that. So they still may never like you or may never support what you're doing, but they have to say, I can't argue with the fact that it's been successful. And for the allies, it will inspire people to greater achievements. It will give people the impetus to continue the work.
If we can stay focused on what progress means to us, right, and keep kind of chipping away at some of those societal ills that we've been dealing with for a long time, I think we can all win as a function of that, right? We can celebrate the progress that we're making as a community. And I think those other communities, other ethnic communities, will benefit from that as well.
I think for us, if we can build this well enough, I think our allies will come very easily, and we can be an organization to be reckoned with here.
I think that AACETS is going to impact New Mexico politics in this way. When people are elected, they have made promises to a constituency. They've made promises to a community. They've made promises to lobbyists. They've made their promises. And I rarely think that they ever feel like they're beholden to the African American community. And we want to change that. We want us to be in the back of their mind. We want us to be in the back of their heart. And we don't want to be an other. And we don't want to be an obligation. We want them to feel like we are part of them and they are part of us.
I think AACETS can be effective in New Mexico's economic future because if the African American community rises in our ability to make businesses and to create income and create churn, as they say in the business world, it affects everybody. It helps everybody in New Mexico. So that's the ultimate goal.
The African Americans, or later to be known as African Americans that were brought over under the auspices of agriculture. And that it is not some sort of hippie, earth first notion to care about this planet, because in our indigenous roots and the first jobs we had for those of us that were brought here was always about land stewardship. It was always about self-care. It's why some of us don't like farming now, frankly, because it's PTSD, right? It's easier to be black in the city than in rural Oklahoma, but that was us too. And I feel like when we take back that narrative, I think that actually goes back to one of my former answers about this kind of mutual collectivism that we really need, especially in New Mexico when we're such a small part of the population. If we can't get people to care about black people, we need to get them to care about something they care about that impacts us.
We still are troubled by the fact that 70% of our students graduate from high school, African American students. So that leaves 30% of our students who are not graduating from high school, and that's just unacceptable. And so in 10 years, AACETS is going to have some major inroads in the educational arena by putting in place some new modalities to reach our black students and let them know that they are important and that their self-esteem is bolstered by the fact that they see more people like them excelling, and we're going to increase those graduation rates as a result. I think that what we do with kids is like we look at them holistically. It's not about a math class or an English class. It's about who is this kid who's sitting in the math class and who's sitting in the English class, and we look at them. For instance, we had a kid in our summer program who was a behavior problem, and I know that in a regular school he would be sitting in a corner somewhere, never being a part of the full body. What we did with him is we worked with him and said, okay, maybe you can't talk about what's making you angry, but can you draw it? And so he drew popcorn, and he was actually an amazing artist. He drew popcorn, but there was a circle around one piece of popcorn, and I said, what is that piece of popcorn? And he said, oh, that's not popcorn, that's a kernel. It's the kernel that didn't pop. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. Can you write a sentence about that? And he said, this is the kernel that didn't pop, asked, why me, and cried. And so that was a tremendous breakthrough with that young man. So we were able to find a way in to get to him, to figure out what was going on with him, and gave him some things to do that made him feel empowered. We determined that he was quite a gifted artist, and we were able to help him use his hands to create this art that people were praising. And we saw a different student leaving our camp than the one that came in.
Yeah, I think that's part of our legacy as a people nationally, and it's part of, it was an important part of this project as well. You know, that some of the elders were able to lend their voices to the project. Those things are important because they help to create a level of credibility around what you're trying to accomplish. In some instances, those who sit on the advisory board, people who are in positions where others see them as leaders in the community, and they have the ability to say, this is something worthy of investment.
A lot of the work that we've been doing with AACETS is we've been talking to people of different ages and talking about generational transfer of the power. We've been looking around and seeing who holds the power, what kind of power is it, and how can we make sure that that power is passed down to the generation that's coming up.
We believe that we stand on the shoulders of those individuals who paved the way, those first in our community who sort of broke through those barriers. And now we stand on their shoulders and we look to them for guidance for how we move forward, and we go forward together and create a better future for our children.
Back in the day, you just send a kid to church, and it's like, you're going to go and get this knowledge, and you're going to learn how to be a pillar of your community, and you're going to do these soup kitchens. And that just doesn't happen anymore. Black church attendance is on a decline. And so we can continue to deride and berate and say, well, if they just went to church, it would be all right. Or we could be like, yo, they're not going to go, and how do we still care for our community and not use that as an easy out?
And what AACETS seeks to do is to find those leaders of the next generation, answer their questions, work with them, develop them to become leaders of the next generation. And those leaders might, as we know, they might not look like the leaders that we've had. You know, they might be an arts leader, or they might be, a poet, or they might be very skilled in other areas that you wouldn't think of as being leaders. But those people are leaders nonetheless, and we want to help develop that kind of leadership.
African American judges, which we have a few of, African American lawyers here who are doing great work. The dean of the law school now is African American, right? So when people are able to ascend and do well in those positions, those of us in the community who are seeing them succeed gives us a different sense of what our leadership can be.
AACETS is by no means trying to position itself as those new leaders, but to give the community a system for finding and cultivating and supporting and protecting those new leaders. I think that's what makes AACETS unique, is that we're not trying to replace the Office of African American Affairs, the NAACP, the SCLC. We don't want their jobs. Your job is safe, it's cool. But what we do want is we want connectivity.
Now, the reason we're different specifically is what we want to do is be a statewide communications hub and help all those organizations coalesce together So we have a more powerful voice, we have a more coherent voice, we have a louder voice certainly. We have a voice that can't be denied if we have everybody in the game, and how we can do this is disseminating lots of information all the time on policy, on politics, on business, on health, on environment, all the issues that affect us here in New Mexico as a people. And so I'm excited about that difference. I think I've been involved in so many things here over 5, 6, 7 years now, trying to do this exact thing, but I think the time is right now. I think a lot of things have come together for us. Technology's on our side. The national situation's on our side actually a little bit, believe it or not, here in early 2017. I think there are more people looking at us and how we contribute to our economy here in New Mexico, and how we can rise up simply as a people and really become more of a force here in New Mexico. I think that makes us different. I really like that a lot.
And so, I don't know, Kellogg took a risk on us and we appreciate it. What they've really allowed us to do with their support and funding over the last 2 years is really do some of this work with the community to kind of articulate what we want, and then shop that resultant idea to other funders, and just giving us the time to do it and allowing us to do it, and not bringing in a consultant from Philly or Chicago to do it, I think is important, because our relationships helped us accomplish this work. But I also think that it's going to be able to give some sustainability.
All right, here's a question. What does the future look like without assets? All right? I don't like it, because here's why. If we don't do what we need to do right now to ensure a future 10 years from now, a generation from now, well, we're going to look at a situation worse than what we have now. I don't mean to sound dramatic about it, but if we don't have policies in place, structures in place, help in place where we need it 10 years from now, without assets, this is what we're going to have forever here in New Mexico for black families.
Without assets, we will continue to be at the top of every bad list, and we'll be at the bottom of every good list. We'll have New Mexico, if we think of it as a chain, one that is sagging in the middle without all of its citizenry being represented. But with assets, and with the work that other organizations like AACETS are doing, we will have an understanding that we are truly better together.
Without assets and the research that we've been collecting, we have no context, there is no next chapter, and our story goes untold.
Here's what folks should know. We are empowered and engaged to work together as a community to make progress. We're going to make these investments in ourselves and invite others to do the same.
What's the worst case scenario? What happens if AACETS doesn't come into existence? The trends that have persisted will continue to persist and get worse. There'll be more violence, there'll be more squalor, because that's what happens. That's what happens when people feel pushed, when people feel not cared for, when people feel like they have to come up with their own solutions independent of a community. And so whatever happens to the black community happens to the rest of the community. We are how we're seen, and if the future persists the way it is without any course correction, it don't look good.